I want to welcome Dr. Gary Meyer, a little bio here. Dr. Gary Meyer is a retired educator. He's taught dozens of courses on various books of the Bible and has a special interest in Christian apologetics and biblical hermeneutics. If you don't know what that word means, I'm sure Dr. Meyer will be happy to explain here in a second. Dr. Gary has been an instructor at the seminary, college, and high school level and has attended he has attended and holds degrees from Florida Beacon Bible College, St. Petersburg Theological Seminary, Beacon Theological Seminary, and Moriah Institute. That's a lot of institutions and books. He is married to Lynn, who is here this evening, and they have 3 grown children. So I want to welcome up Dr. Gary Meyer.
Yeah, make the questions as hard as you want, because all I got to say is, I don't know, it was before my time. That should fit just about anything. What is hermeneutics? I could answer that. All right, let's see. Well, I don't want to give this away, but they did promise me that I could go up to an hour. But it's the kind of thing that I think you'll enjoy, and an hour should go by pretty quickly. If I can reset my clock here. Okay, so well, first of all, I want to thank John for his introduction and for giving me the opportunity to speak. And I want a little bit of shout out to my friend Stephen Ives, who gave me a good recommendation with John. And I got some friends here from the Goldsmith Coffee House as well. And if you have never been there, and I have not been asked to do a commercial, if you've never been there, it's the best place in town for coffee. And I'm not just saying that. I hang out at coffee shops now. My wife said I can't hang out at the bars anymore. So it's the next best place. So we are going to talk about a subject called apologetics. And apologetics is, in fact, you can even hear in the title of the word, what English word can you hear in there? Apology. I got to watch how I project. I'm not used to having a mic. Apology. But really, somebody said, so you mean like it's apologizing for being a Christian? No, nothing like that. But if you think about it, if you've ever had to apologize, and who hasn't, don't you often try to explain yourself and give reasons for why you did something? Okay, that's what this is about, giving reasons for your faith. Can you guys, am I echoing too much? But I don't know what they can do about that. Can you understand me back there? Okay, good. There's always some people in the crowd who say, look, I already have a relationship with my church and with my Lord, and I don't need any evidence because the Holy Spirit's in my heart. Okay? And you know what? That's true if you kind of just take it from a personal standpoint. But, how many of us in here have family members and friends that we would that are not, they're not believers for one reason or another, or maybe they've fallen away from the faith, and so eventually they'll make the same decision that we have made in terms of recognizing who Christ is and how bad we need him and the forgiveness that comes through his death and resurrection. But some people need a little bit more than just that simple message, especially in the modern age where we're hit with all sorts of evolutionary principles, for instance, that seem to kind of get in the way, and all sorts of things like, can we trust our Bible? And one of the most common questions is, the Bible's been copied over so many times, how can it possibly be correct? How can it possibly be even close to the original documents? Now, is that a stupid question? I don't think it is. But we do have some really good evidence for that. And so this is about presenting evidence tonight, and it's going to focus a lot on archaeology. But let's go into what might be considered the thesis statement for this subject of apologetics. You know, my computer's been working all day long without a single problem. But now, it's a little different. Give me just a second and then I'll be all right. I got to start my clock because I'm used to teaching for 90 minutes. And that probably would happen. You guys would fall asleep on me. So here we are. This is the thesis verse for apologetics, which is defending the faith. The Greek word for apologetics is apologia, and that was the name given if you were a lawyer during the time of Christ. Because what does a lawyer do? He defends his client, right? So, there are 3 criteria to doing good apologetics. Number 1 would be, you have to first be a believer yourself. That almost goes without saying, right? You're not even going to want to talk about Christ if you don't know him. So, sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts. So you have your own faith. You're not perfect because no human being has ever been perfect, and they never will be. We all know that. That's not even something to talk about. The second one, always be ready to give an explanation to anyone who asks you for a reason for your hope. Now, what it's not saying is always be ready to answer any question, like the easy one, where does God come from? I just tell people, now how and why in the world would I know the answer to that? I barely know where I come from. Well, there are some good answers, but I like the sarcasm. So, but look at this is not as hard as it seems. It doesn't say always be ready to answer any question, does it? It says be ready to answer and explain to someone the reason for your hope. And your hope is in Christ. So it's a real simple, at least we ought to be able to do that simple message. Okay. And then the last part is inevitably where we're going to mess up if we're not careful. Do this with gentleness and reverence, or some versions say respect. And you know that there are certain subjects that they tell you not to talk about, right? And one is politics. Of course, we do it anyway, but I mean, because you're going to get this. Well, what's another subject you're not supposed to talk about? Religion. I've actually found that what I've noticed is politics is more volatile than religion, at least the last few years. But people tend to be kind of set in their ways in a lot of things. So you have to know when to back off. If somebody wants to hear about your faith and wants to hear about who you think Jesus is and wants to hear how you feel about macroevolution, which is the stuff that eventually turns apes into men, instead of making tall people out of a tall mom and dad. Microevolution, we might call that. So this is the one you got to watch. And when I was younger, I was pretty good at getting people mad. And didn't bother me much either. Until finally one of my teachers says, but don't you realize you're losing your effectiveness when you do that? And you're probably closing the door on the next conversation. And we don't want to do that. Again, because we're probably talking to somebody we love, who's fallen away from the faith or who haven't heard it. We live in a time now where there's a generation coming up where their parents maybe didn't take them to church. I'm an old guy. And in my little town just north of here, nothing was open on Sunday except maybe one gas station. Completely shut. You know why? Because everybody went to church and all the kids went to Sunday school. And they had basic knowledge. That's not true anymore. So you could actually run into people who have not heard the gospel message. And so you might get a shot at that. This is important. I'm going to be off to the races here in a minute, but I want to put the right foundation down. You are not responsible for their response, other than you need to be able to talk to them about Jesus and you need to be nice. You're not controlling their response, so don't get this idea, well, I must have said something wrong because they're not coming to church with me next week. No. You see, Paul said in Corinthians, I planted, and Paul did plant the church in Corinth. Apollos, who was the minister or the teacher, I should say, that Paul left in Corinth. Apollos watered what Paul planted. But who's responsible for the growth? God. God's going to get the home run in the end. We're fortunate enough and blessed enough to be a part of the process. And so I don't ever, if I can share a little something with somebody without being overbearing and nice about it, and you just got to kind of read the room, so to speak, and know when to stop. Okay? So that when I understood that, it encouraged me a lot more. Because I used to think that I'm going to have to talk here until the person says, what must I do to enter salvation? Or something like that. And sometimes that can happen. But I found that most of the time, I'm a waterer. And once in a while, I got to do some planting. But God makes it grow, okay? Well, we're going to be talking, in the majority of this, we're going to be talking about archaeology. So an archaeology is an established science. You can go off to one of a dozen really good archaeology schools in the U.S. here and get your PhD and start digging if you want to. Good schools are anything from the smaller schools like Wheaton College out to University of Pennsylvania, Samford in Alabama, University of South Florida in Tampa, University of Denver, University of Arizona, and Michigan, University of Michigan. Those are some of the finest in the country. And so there's a lot to learn. Archaeology didn't really get off the ground until the early 1800s. And then it took a while before they really started discovering things. But this is called the Fertile Crescent. And it's really, it's just what it says. This is where the fertile land is, from the Persian Gulf and the city of Ur, which is where Abraham was moved from, all the way up and around and down through Egypt. This is where crops can be grown. Even the armies of Babylon and Assyria and the Hittites and the Greeks later on and the Romans after that would come down through here because it wasn't too prevalent to have ships, although the Romans had some and the Babylonians had some too. But, the straight line approach would take them across 400 miles of desert. So this is the Levant, this is the Fertile Crescent, and most of biblical archaeology happens in this area, especially the Old Testament stuff. So archaeology is the study of material evidence. In other words, it's not theory so much as it is, look what we found, now we have to try to explain how it relates to the Bible. Now, of course, I'm talking tonight mostly about biblical archaeology, and there's some archaeologists that are also priests, ministers, pastors, okay? A couple of the really dynamic archaeologists were Catholics, and so these are people that are highly educated, and they're going and they're discovering things, artifacts, things like pottery, stone tools, bones, coins, weapons, all things that you can kind of figure out, well, who left that here? And when did they leave it here? And you begin to put together a chronology and a history. And then at some point the question is, does this biblical chronology and history, does it mirror the actual world history that we have and that we learn about? And it really does so quite well in what we have found, which is probably about 1% of what's available. That's how young the science still is. There are archaeological sites that have been designated, usually by colleges. Oh, let's go there. Let's see if we can go there. Lots of red tape for those colleges. They have to get permission. They have to be financed, and then they go there and they perform a dig, usually in the summers, because during the school year they take a lot of students with them, so those students are in school, and the archaeologists are usually professors at colleges. So it's only about 3-4 months a year, and it takes, there's some sites that they've been to for 30 consecutive summers. So this is a long-term deal to dig through an ancient city. A shard or sherd is a tiny piece, well, it could be any size, but usually just a piece of broken pottery. You wouldn't think so, but trained archaeologists can look at that piece of pottery and date it by looking at it within 50 years. And now they can run scans on it, analyze the clay, and compare it against a database of clay around the world and know exactly where it was made. That's pretty incredible. That gives them a lot of information. Ostraca are pieces of pottery, but they're pieces of pottery with writing on them. And certainly not all of this writing has to do with the Bible. Some of them had to do with land purchases or agreements between people. But there are some that do relate to passages of usually the Old Testament. A stratum is one layer of earth. Now let me explain to you what I mean by that. In ancient times, cities were pretty small. Some of the largest cities were, not much bigger than Chippewa Falls, area-wise. So we're not looking at these massive cities. But they are almost all located on a hill, because you're going to have enemies, and you would rather have your enemy have to come up the hill, right? Ever play King on the Hill when you were a little kid? Okay, some of you are going, what in the world is that? The tough guy gets on the top of the snowbank, and you run up there and try to knock him down. And then you get to stand up there for 3 to 5 seconds. Okay, but what they did is they would find a hill, and then they would make sure that there was a water source, usually within a mile, and sometimes a lot closer than that. Somewhere, it's going to be on the bottom of the hill in most cases. And then when the city was destroyed, and they were, because there wasn't a conglomeration of cities, they were basically all city-states. So they were all independent of one another. So when an army came in, when the Hittites came in, when Assyria came in, they were easy pickings. But much harder if you've got a city wall, which many of them would have. Jericho was a very small city. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But there is no way that the Israelites could scale those walls in Jericho. They had the tallest walls in all of Canaan. And so those people in Jericho, they could stand on the top of their wall and go, yeah, 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 yeah. But they were outnumbered about 1,000 to 1 by the Israelites. So if the Israelites could just get through the wall, but there was no way technologically to do that at that time period. You probably know the story. I'll show you a picture a little bit later. So as the cities were destroyed and rebuilt, remember, they were built out of mud brick or very soft limestone, and there was a tendency when one city was destroyed, they'd smash it down and build the next city right on top of it. And that's what happened. That's what is on this. You can see the level 1 is here, level 2, level 3. And so archaeologists can dig down, and of course the oldest occupation will be near the bottom, and the newest on top, right? And they can begin to look at these various tells. Tell is the Hebrew word for hill. And they can look at them and they can begin to put something together. For instance, let's say the top of the tell, and many of them were grown over with grass, and for a long time they thought they were just hills, until an early archaeologist, Albright, in the early 1800s, said, I think that might be a city. And sure enough, and now there's over 10,000 of them, and only about 5% have been looked at. And still, there's a massive amount of things that relate to the Bible that's been discovered. Okay, this is just a cutout that shows, I wanted you to get some idea on how archaeology is done before we actually look at the slides, okay? So, in the case of this city, there's an occupation on the top. That would be worse because you're not going to really get permission to do much digging in Jerusalem, are you? The city's occupied. Somebody's going to come over to your house and say, hey, can I dig in your basement for 40 years? You know, it's hard. But on the outside of the city, in the smaller towns that are from the Old Testament times, many of them are unoccupied and grown over, and then they have to go through the Israeli government to get permission. They do things like create this stairway. By they, I mean archaeologists. And that way they can get a quick picture of what's on the bottom layer, the next one, the next one, the next one, and kind of know what they're dealing with. They might pull some pottery out of there. These are excavation squares that eventually they do. That's where you see people going through those squares with a teaspoon and a small paintbrush. Because you can't be walking, you walk around in there and you step on a $3,000 clay pot that wasn't broken, but now it is. You know, so this is kind of how they do things in a nutshell. In every time period, they made their pottery a little bit different. So an archaeologist might find these little lamps. You put olive oil in them and you run a wick right out here. These things are only about so long. And they put the oil in, the oil was cheap, and they could put this in their house, usually have several of them. They wouldn't even let them go out. Just kept pouring more oil in. But do you see this, how different the styling is from different time periods? So when they excavate a tell, they might pull out one like this, and they can say, okay, Byzantine period at level 5, 350 to 500 AD. And that's why it becomes more of an exact science than you might think. Pottery types, you can see how different they are. Some have serrations in them. Some have these little lips. Some even have a double lip system. Well, let's look at, and they're not always intact. In fact, the bigger pottery is going to be broken almost every time. But at a museum or at a university, they have people that are highly trained in reassembling these things. Now, they might leave the little hole in there, or they might fill it in so that it looks like it's intact. All right, now let's see. Oh, so you're telling me that every group has different pottery? Yep, that's what I'm telling you. So this is Philistine pottery, and you can see there's some geometric shapes. Here's some kind of a bird that could represent one of their idols. And here is Phoenician pottery. So the Philistines lived on the southwest coast of Israel, bordering the Mediterranean Sea. I'll show you a map later. And the Phoenicians were more toward the north. But can you see it's a different kind of clay? This is a reddish clay. So again, scholars could have this analyzed nowadays and tell you the area that it's from. And the Phoenicians they used more of the straight line and circles, but there's a double lip system. A trained archaeologist would glance at this and immediately be able to date it and tell you where it's from. Okay. But Israeli pottery, the Israelites were concerned that they didn't do anything to worship idols. So there's no shapes on their pottery, there's no pictures on their pottery. They're playing. The sad thing about it is they were able to stay pure here, but did they end up worshiping idols? Yeah, I'm afraid they did. But this is how Israeli pottery. Now, I'm not saying that some, progressive potter from Israel never painted a pot. But most of them would have been very careful. And ancient Israeli pottery today is largely plain. Coins are another thing. And coins are great because you can get very close to an absolute date at a certain level. All right? Now, coins, I want to take a guess and say coins started to come in maybe around 600, 700 BC. Before that, they had talents of gold. You probably heard that language. But after that, then, and there's a lot of coins that have been found. I have a Roman denarius of Vespasian in my wallet. Afterwards, if one of you just can't stand it and have to see it, just come up and see me, okay? And I only paid $20 for it. Now, there's all sorts of American coins that cost a lot more than that. Why? Because they found probably 2 million of them at all these different sites. And, of course, if you want one of Caesar Augustus when Jesus was born, that's going to cost you about $500. And then Tiberius, when he had his adult ministry, that one's going for $300 and $400. I can't spring for that. So, but anyway, coins, very definitive in archaeology. When the archaeologists found something in a certain location, they recorded exactly in those excavation squares, everything. Now they use GPS, exactly where it was found, exactly on what level. Then they photograph it. They show you how big it is because, in the future years, you're not going to know how big that coin is just by looking at it because they're, And then they number it. And when they're done excavating, they write a report for the year. So what happens then, if that excavation site goes without anybody excavating there for a bunch of years, then they can look at the report and they'll know how to continue and what's already been found. Okay, they do readings sometimes every day or more or less as needed. One of my teachers here, I don't want to give his name because you'll think it's strange. Actually, that's what it is, Dr. Strange. But he's not strange at all. And I learned a lot from that guy. Oh, here's one that will illustrate the value of archaeology, yet this doesn't have anything directly to do with the Bible. The Rosetta Stone was discovered by Napoleon's men as they went through Egypt in 1799. That's AD, of course. And they found this near a very small town named Rosetta, so that's how they got the name. Now, at this time, about AD 1800, no one could read Egyptian hieroglyphics. No one could read it. Because they made the assumption that the pictures either have to stand for sounds in the Egyptian alphabet or concepts, right? What they never considered is that some pictures are sounds and some pictures are concepts. And so they really needed a key to find out how to read hieroglyphics. Well, this is, as I said, was a little bit earlier than Napoleon as far as when it was from, but scholars looked at this and they realized, well, this is hieroglyphics, we can't read that, not to mention how much of it is missing. Well, about half, I'd say. And the second script is Demotic, not demonic, Demotic, Demotic, and this was a later Egyptian language. They could read that. And the bottom one is the same type of Greek that's used in the New Testament, Koine, or Common Greek. So now they realized this is saying the same thing as this is. So the natural conclusion is what? The hieroglyphics have the same message. So now they can look at the hieroglyphics and kind of reverse engineer it and say, well, we know it says this, so let's try to figure out how. And they were able to do that in about 35 years. That's how long it took before a gentleman named Champollion, I think, finally kind of cracked the code, and then over the next few decades, the word got out, and today they can read hieroglyphics. The other thing that's tricky is if there's a main component in a sentence in hieroglyphics, is you read from the outside in on both sides. Now, who would have thought of that? I mean, bad enough that Hebrew is right to left. Took me about half of my first semester to get that down. What do you write it? Why are you trying to read it backwards? So this is important in that it just, now you can get a PhD in Egyptology, but in the early 1800s, they knew the pyramids were there. They knew they meant something, but they couldn't read anything. Okay? And the French were very happy to sell this to the British. The French, at least at that time, didn't have a lot of academic prowess. Okay? I realize now the Louvre is in Paris, but the great museum. But at that time, they sold it. And that's fine. You can go to the British Museum and see this. I'd like to go there, but not just to see this. But those French soldiers, I got a little grudge against them. You know how the Sphinx, how the nose has had some deterioration, but the rest of the Sphinx is in pretty good shape? Yeah, the French. They use the nose for target practice. So I've held a grudge against them most of my life. But anyway, I'll get over it someday. This Egyptian idol was found in Bethesda, which was right up near Jesus' home base in Capernaum, at the top of the Sea of Galilee, and yet it's an Egyptian idol. And you can probably see how big it is. People would carry these around, and unfortunately, Bethesda was a Jewish city. So you can see there's this influx of worshiping idols. And that's why God said, you got to stay away from those Canaanites. It's kind of like the same principle. If you're a believer and you marry an unbeliever, you're likely to have, everything will be fine at first. Okay? Until your kids grow up, and then the unbeliever says, you're not taking them to church. You're not talking to them about Jesus. I know a couple families where this exact thing happened. So 1 Corinthians warns us about that, So idol worship was a big problem. Now, Joshua's conquest, we're going to get into a couple of really cool ones here. Joshua, of course, took over for Moses after Moses led the people through the wilderness for 39 and a half years. Now, why did I say it like that? Because I'm trying to tell you that when the number 40 gets used in the Bible, it's not usually meant to be exact. Okay? It's kind of like if we're visiting and I say, well, I'll see you next year. You could interpret that to mean, I'm going to see him again in 365 and a quarter days. No, it just means sometimes next year. So it was close to 40 years. That's a trivia question for you, or that you can use if you really want to. So Joshua takes over, and he's going into the land. They're entering right here. They're not coming up from the south, because then all the city-states, and there's a lot more, there's probably 100 of them, they might group together and be able to fight the army. So they sneak up through the side here, through the deserts, through Moab, and they're going to split the enemy in half. I have a former student who got accepted to West Point and graduated from there, and he came to visit me a couple years ago, and he said, hey, Doc, I had a class on famous battles, and Joshua's battle was in the book. Because it's a common thing, right? If you can divide, then it's easier to conquer. And so Joshua came in with his army. Jericho's the first city he got to. And then he went and took all the southern cities. It took 30 years. Then he came back and went in and took the northern cities. It took almost another 30 years. So this was Joshua's life. Okay, so the story of Jericho, I'm sure you know this. As the horns blew, the people began to shout. Remember how God said, march around the city every day for 7 days? So on the seventh day, the people began to shout. When they heard the sound of the horn, they raised a tremendous shout, and the wall collapsed, and the people attacked the city, went straight in, and took it. Now, it seems whenever a miracle happens, have you ever met somebody that thinks that what you have to do with a miracle is try to come up with a rational explanation for it? So you see, they were yelling so loud that it created a sonic boom. And the sonic boom then had a force on the wall and, oh, come on. No, the very definition of a biblical miracle means that some law of science has been contradicted, right? When that water turned to wine in a matter of minutes, there's no explanation that you can come up with, because it just doesn't happen like that. And really, you can do that with every miracle. So the wall collapsed and the people went straight in. I think if you want to talk about natural causes, there is a fault line that starts in Russia and goes straight down through the middle of Israel, all the way down into Africa. Okay? Western Africa. So maybe God caused an earthquake at the exact time. That's the miracle, perhaps. But the wall went down. Now, the whole wall didn't go down, but a section of it went down. Now, the thing is it fell outward. That's evidence that the Israelites didn't knock it down, right? If they would have knocked it down with a battering ram, which weren't in use at that time period, it would have fell inward. So there is a portion of the wall that archaeologists have found that fell outward. And let me tell you, you're talking about maybe 1,000 people inside of Jericho. That's how small it was. Now you realize that 50% were women. Then you probably got another 20% that were not old enough to fight, right? And then you got some older people. We'll say that's 10%. So that means Jericho had about 20% of fighters. That's 200. And Israel came out of the wilderness with 2 million people. That battle must have been over in about 4 minutes. And Jericho was put on display. And this must have scared the Canaanites, because nobody at that time had a taller wall. And it was a double wall, too. Even if you get out and down with the first one, you got another one. So this must have it was a great movement, and the people used their faith, and God helped them. City's been found, of course. This is the bottom of a tower. Now, archaeologists have dated this tower to 10,000 BC, so that can get in the way of what some of us believe in terms of how old the earth is. I keep asking myself, why is that so important that we need to argue about it? Why? God did it, right? No matter how old it is, He is the creator. So maybe it is that old. I don't know. Maybe it's older. But I'm not going to lose any sleep tonight about that. Hard to know, but this is, I don't know. It's only a few acres. It's not very large. But the bragging rights came again with the fortification of those tall walls. Now God said, do not rebuild the city, but He didn't say that they couldn't build a new Jericho about 2 miles to the south. So they did. And that's why you find Jericho mentioned in the New Testament. Now, this is kind of a cool one too. I know this map is a little wordy here, but the Philistines would live down here. This is the Mediterranean Sea. In these cities, the 5 Philistine cities, Eglon, Ashdod, Ascalon, Ekron, and Gath. Gath is where Goliath was from. Interesting, one of the cities was called, even in the Philistine times, was called Gaza. And this is precisely where Gaza is today. Okay? Well, Joshua kind of decided where all the 12 tribes were going to live. And he put the tribe of Dan right next to these maniacs called the Philistines. And let me tell you, they couldn't get a good night's sleep there. Constant skirmishes, plus they were a warlike people. They were built bigger. They had tools and weapons that Israel didn't have yet. And the people of Dan says, we're gone. We're leaving. And they packed up their bags and they took the tribe of Dan all the way up here and took this Canaanite city and renamed it Dan. And now they were fine, okay? And if you'll notice, they picked the farthest point away from the Philistines. Jonah did the same thing when he ran from God. He picked the farthest point away from Nineveh. He says, no, thank you. I'm going to physically go in the opposite direction, which was Tarshish. God had to take some extraordinary measures to stop him. He could have used somebody else, but he didn't want to. All right. Well, they found that city, and this is, you can see the main gate of the city of Dan, which started out as a Canaanite city, then was taken over by the Israelites. It's in pretty bad shape. So they called Loopy and had him build a dome around it. Right here. And if you're not from around here, that one didn't work for you, but that's all right. It looks maybe even a little bit better. But anyway, and this helped just preserve it so it wouldn't get rained on because they dug it out of the ground. But interesting thing about a lot of these city gates that prevented them from being taken over so easily is they had kind of an entrance, and then they had a turn and another turn and sometimes several turns before you'd come out on the other side single file. And you didn't want to be a soldier walking into that mess, coming into that city single file, because somebody's on the other side ready to go clonk. And they killed them one by one. And in fact, when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem in AD 70 and the temple, there was a period of time where they were coming into Jerusalem one by one. And after the bodies got about this high, they decided to stop. And then they battered their way through the wall over a period of several months. So that's the city of Dan. Now, John alluded to the fact that in the early 1800s, people were starting to question the Bible. Scholars, so-called scholars, and questioned the history of it. And part of what we're doing tonight is we're showing that the history is reasonable, in fact, can be compared to contemporary secular history. And that kind of shows, hey, we're on the right track here with the Bible, right? If we find out that there is no King David, there is no Moses, and the history of the Old Testament is just fabricated stories, what happens to our faith in Christ? Because remember, his lineage goes all the way back through those kings, all the way to King David. And so it's very important that we do have some verification for this. And this is a drawing, and you can see that not only would they have people up above here that could fight, but again, this would have been something where you couldn't walk straight in at the city of Dan. Now, in 1993, a woman from Israel that often volunteered to help out with archaeological digs. You know, if you want to travel over there for a summer and be a helper on a dig, they will let you. Of course, you got to pay your own travel, but I mean, they're happy to have workers for these archaeological digs. And when she was retired, it was just something she did. And so they were excavating Dan, and they hadn't found anything that day, and she was a little bit discouraged about that. And as she was walking down the hill to go home, she found this slab with writing on it. It's really not that big. It's maybe about like so. And she knew that it was Aramaic. Aramaic is similar to Hebrew. Some of the letters are almost the same. And she knew it was something. And so she ran over and showed the archaeologist, and his mouth dropped. Because they hadn't had a lot of evidence for the existence of David. More or less just the stories of the Bible. But what this says, and in Aramaic, which is read right to left, B-E-T-D-V-D. And no, this is not an early prophecy regarding video recording. B-E-T means house. Bet or Beth, Bethlehem. House of bread. Lehem is bread in Hebrew. Bethlehem. Bethel, Bethel. House of God. The prefix El was a generic form of God. Okay? So, this says house, and what do you think DVD stands for? House of David. And what that meant is that these people in the city of Dan were a membership of David's kingdom. And then they began to find this same phrase in several other sites. And after, I'm going to show you some of the other kings that were discovered to be true. And so it forms this, excuse me, this timeline that we really need. Okay, I'm going to go a little faster. This is one of my favorite ones. This is during Joshua's conquering of the northern kingdom, and one of the main cities up there was called Hatzor. Hatzor was probably the largest city, and you can see it was one of the first cities going into Canaan. So if you were an invading army, Hittites, Assyrians, Babylonians, what would you do with Hatzor? You're going to make an impression. That city's going to be destroyed so that the fear comes down to the other cities. Hatzor was destroyed according to the number of layers or levels. Hatzor has been destroyed 22 times. I can only imagine what State Farm would charge people who lived in Hatzor. And it really did go up every month. So, in the book of Joshua, well, here's the tell. It's one of the larger ones, and yet it's only 200 acres. That's less than a square mile. But, people got in there like sardines, so it was pretty. But look, there's been two excavations here that I know of. One from 1955 under the archaeologist Yigal Yadin, and then another one recently that I think is still going on. So this has been looked at for 25 years, 25 seasons, and you can tell they barely scratched the surface, literally. Most of the tell is still left. There's a lot more to be discovered. So it's a slower process, okay? But in the book of Joshua, here's a statement, and it says, however, Israel did not destroy by fire any of the cities built on their mounds or tells, except for Hatzor, which Joshua burned. Well, why wouldn't you want to burn all the cities down? Well, it's obvious, because they wanted to occupy the cities. You burn those cities down, you can be dealing with 10, 15, 20 feet of ash that's going to have to be moved out. So they normally wouldn't burn the city. But if you look back in Joshua, a few verses before this, God specifically said, when you take Hatzor, burn it down. And so they were just following what God said, what God told them to do. So they burned it. All right. So along comes Yigal Yadin in 1955. So about 3,000 years after Hatzor was burned. And Yadin, who's a believer, he's an Orthodox Jew, so he's got the Torah and the book of Joshua, the Tanakh, in front of him, and is using it to kind of guide his excavation. And many cities have been identified by using the Bible. There's even a book out called The Bible Was My Treasure Map. It's an archaeology book. Because once you identify one city, the Bible will tell you where the next one is, and the next one, and the next one. Very accurate geographically, accurate on almost every level. Look what they started to dig down, and Yigal Yadin, the archaeologist, knew that the Bible said Hatzor was burned. Here's the burn layer, right where it should be, corresponding to about 1400 BC. Time period's right, there's the burn layer. Now this is the edge of the tell, so it doesn't look like very much. But when they dug in, Yadin estimated that it could be 10 to 15 feet deep in the center. Or maybe they moved some of that out before they built the next one. But that's really good evidence. I mean, you can be an agnostic, an atheist, but how can you deny that what happened in the book of Joshua is right here? I mean, I guess you can deny it just because you want to. Now, some people do that. They only accept the data that supports their worldview. That's not a good way to learn things. Okay, Hezekiah's seal has been found. He was one of the kings of Judah. Now, after Solomon, the nation of Israel split off into two. That's why right up through Solomon, you hear only the word Israel in the Old Testament. Then all of a sudden, you read Israel and Judah. That's because the nation divided in 930 BC after the reign of Solomon. Solomon is noted for his wisdom, but he didn't apply that wisdom in his marriage life. Okay, because in Deuteronomy 17, God says, do not multiply wives unto yourself. So yeah, you can get away with it. And as a king, a lot of those marriages were done to fortify a peace treaty between the various city-states. And quite possibly Solomon may not have known the name of a very large number of that harem. And I'm thinking, who would want that kind of responsibility in the first place? All right. So when the nation broke off, Israel at that point had 19 more kings, and Judah had 20. None of the kings in the northern kingdom of Israel were good kings. By good, I mean godly. 7 or 8 in Judah were good kings. By good, I mean godly. The reason it's 7 or 8 is nobody knows how to classify Manasseh because he was the worst king they ever had until the end of his life, and then he believed the Lord. So you got to give him credit for that, but I might keep him in the bad king list if it was up to me. 55 years of damage. Yow. But Hezekiah was a good king of Judah. And this is his seal. It's been found. It's a piece of clay that says specifically, and they would use that to formalize documents. Sometimes see that. People say, well, it could have been a different Hezekiah. Excellent. Okay. Well, let's see what the seal says. Belonging to Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah. Does that narrow it down to one person? Absolutely. Okay? Absolutely. Now, during Hezekiah's life, the Assyrians destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel, 722 BC. And they were coming for the southern kingdom as well. But between that 722 date and the date that Hezekiah had to defend against the Assyrians at Jerusalem, there was a 20-year gap. So Hezekiah, being smart, says, we got to get ready for the Assyrians because they will be here. So they began to plan for the Assyrian attack. This is actually an Assyrian document. When you get your enemy to testify for you, that's a good sign of truth. If your enemy says, yeah, he's really a nice guy, you probably are. Okay? Because they don't usually say stuff like that. So there's Assyrian documents. This is the Taylor Prism. I think this is the one that's in the Oriental Museum in Chicago. But it says, I, Sennacherib, who was the Assyrian commander that destroyed, actually his father destroyed the northern kingdom, I captured 46 towns and villages of Judah. That's the southern kingdom. And I shut up Hezekiah the Jew like a bird in a cage in Jerusalem, his royal city, 701. Now you might say, well, how can we know that it was 701? Because the Assyrians did us a big favor with determining the dates of the Old Testament. They would link their events to solar eclipses. Can you go back and calculate the exact day that an eclipse was over the city of Nineveh? Yes, you can, just like we know where future eclipses are going to be. So that's where we get our accuracy. Thank you, Assyria. They were a vicious people. They captured you. They cut your skin. They cut your skin off. I could go on and on. If I had more time, I would, just to see you guys cringe. But everybody was afraid of the Assyrians. So Hezekiah then, this is going back to 701, and by this time Hezekiah is ready for the attack. Because they can't get through the wall. The Jerusalem walls were tall, double thickness, they couldn't get through. Battering rams were really used more so from the kingdom of Babylon onward. Babylonians had it, the Greeks had battering rams, and of course the Romans did. But here, they can't get in a city. So what do? The well for the water's on the outside of the city. So what you're going to do is surround the city with Assyrian troops and not let anybody get any water. You know? And they'd say things like, hey, you guys want to come out and get some water? That didn't work out too well. They took their skin off and nailed it to the city wall. So, but what they didn't know is that Hezekiah, for almost a 20-year period, was building an underground tunnel from the Gihon Spring, which was their water source outside of the gate, up to the wall, and along the wall to the pool of Siloam. And they had plenty of water. But of course, it took the water level at the spring way down, so guess who doesn't have water? That's right, the skin pullers. And they're having a trouble feeding their army too, which is estimated to be around 200,000 at this campaign. So they were there for months, and the Israelites on the inside of Jerusalem, they even had some gardens in there. And they had all sorts of dry grain. And so they had enough food, they had enough water, wait them out. Now the Bible says an angel came and destroyed much of that Assyrian army. Now that's not recorded. That's not recorded on the Assyrian document. But I don't know. Those Assyrian documents tended to be trophy texts. I know I don't have a trophy from 1977 when I was in a tennis tournament and the other guy tore me to pieces. I don't have a trophy for that. I've got some other trophies that I want, but that year I want to forget. So that's why the Assyrian document probably doesn't say anything about the destruction of much of the army. Instead, they say they got called to another front. Okay, I don't know where it is, but directionally, I'd say down. So, Nineveh has been discovered as well. I'm going to go a little bit faster because I got about 10 minutes left. Nineveh's been found. It was underneath the ground for well over 1,000 years. And in the early 1800s, it was found by a gentleman by the name of Layard. Okay? And they restored one of the gates. Look how massive and thick those walls are. And yet the Babylonians later on would take a battering ram, and they didn't care if it took 6 months. They were going to get through that wall, and they did. There's actually 13 gates at Nineveh like this one. This one's been restored, and they're working on the second one. You remember back, I don't know, that's trivia, but I'll give it to you quick. Saddam Hussein, he wanted to make Babylon and Nineveh into a tourist attraction. And there were things in place to make that happen. But it didn't work out quite that way. Oh, look at the Assyrian pottery, and can you see how unique it is from the ones in the previous part of the slideshow? It's got a increased diameter there in the middle, different markings, different clay coverings. Okay, I'm moving fast. I'm going to have to skip a few now, which reminds me, I think, John, are we going to have a downloadable? This PowerPoint will be on the Catholicism on Tap website. If you want to download it, I'm going to waive my normal $100 fee by 100%. And so you can have it for nothing. Maybe you can use it, some of you younger people, maybe even at school. And if you don't have PowerPoint, you can download a PowerPoint reader on Android or Apple iOS so you can look at the slides. So if you're interested in that, go over and grab that.
We actually turned it into a PDF.
Oh, good.
So it's a downloadable PDF.
So it's a PDF so everybody can see it.
Thank you, sir.
Well, good. PDF's better anyway because I'm afraid you guys might change the slides around or something. Just for fun. I don't like what he said. So, the word of Jeremiah the prophet spoke to Baruch, son of Neriah, when he wrote on a scroll the words of Jeremiah's own mouth. So Baruch was Jeremiah's professional scribe. So in almost every case, when the Bible was copied over, it wasn't copied over by somebody in the corner who said, "Hey, what you doing today, man? You want to copy the Bible for me?" No, these are professionals. This is what they do for a living, is copy texts over. So you can imagine that they did a pretty good job. Well, Baruch, but he's not a main character. He's just a scribe who took down what Jeremiah said, but we've got his seal. And this fits too. The book of Jeremiah says that Baruch is the name of the scribe. It even gives his father's name, which is also on here. And so now we got minor characters of the Bible being verified. Here is somebody, I'm not going to read all this due to time, Jotham, King Uzziah, he was a good king, but most of you probably either never heard of him or certainly don't know what he did. Yet he was a good king. The Bible doesn't say all that much about him. But there is something that he did. He got out of his lane because the people that should have been offering the sacrifices for forgiveness, or I should say covering of sin, were the priests. And Uzziah, as the king, said, "Hey, I think I can get in on this action, and I'm going to offer the sacrifice. I'm going to burn the incense." And, God's a little fussy on stuff like that. So you just let the priests in your parish, you just let them do the job, okay? Who knows what'll happen? So God gave him leprosy. Now, of course, you probably heard, God never, ever, has ever made anybody sick. Well, you take your marker and you come up here and cross that out then. Now, I don't think he does that as a national pastime, but in certain situations, people were punished, and Uzziah was punished with leprosy. The funny thing is we don't know where a lot of the kings are buried, and they generally didn't use markers like a tombstone, but they did for Uzziah. And they found this outside of Jerusalem. I want to say within the last 30 years. Yesterday I knew the date, today I don't. The bones of Uzziah, king of Judah, rest here, do not open. Now, I don't. Who would open it? Well, there could be valuables in there. Well, why'd they say do not open? The leprosy. And there are diseases, of course, you probably know that you can catch from dead bodies. So that's interesting. So other kings here's a signet ring for Jotham. He's in the line of Christ. Hoshea, he's in the line of Christ. This is actually a signet ring that was wore around the neck. It's a little bit, it's not that big, but it's a little bigger than a ring for your hand. And then this is the imprint that he would use for the documents. Okay, so I think John said I can go till what time, John? Oh, it's time for me to stop. Okay, give me about 2 or 3 minutes.
You can go until 1:45, and that's when childcare goes out. We can go past 1:45. We do have some pretty juicy questions back here, though.
Okay. I want to talk about the Canaanites for a minute because this, one of the questions that comes up in apologetics fairly often are when people say something like, how could a good God tell the Israelites to go into the land of Canaan and get rid of all the Canaanites, and if you have to kill them, then kill them for their abominations and their worship of false gods? Now, Joshua couldn't follow through. He didn't. So many Canaanites remained in the land. I don't know if I could have followed through. But it ended up to be a big problem. And God warned even the very God that the Canaanites would bring into Israel, the God of Molech, who had this practice. If you wanted to worship Molech, you would sacrifice your firstborn child to him. And you would do that, and this is an actual Canaanite site that's 26 feet across. And there's DNA at the site where the brass image of Molech would be, and people would wrap their newborn babies in a cloth, heat that brass up to 3,000 degrees, and fry them alive. That is the type of evil that God had in mind when he said, you've got to get rid of those Canaanites. When I read that, it makes me wonder, it's a form of abortion, really, if you want to look at it that way. And archaeologists have verified, because they found some ancient areas where there were Israelite houses, and under the front door would be these little urns with the ashes of the child. They did it, okay? One of the persons people who brought this in was Jezebel. And Ahab married her. She was from Phoenicia, where they worshiped the god Molech. So I'm really sorry that I didn't go a little faster, because the Dead Sea Scrolls is where we kind of get into the accuracy of the Bible. But that's okay. I can do this in about 3 minutes, and then we'll be done. In 1947, near the Dead Sea, where it's very, very dry, they found in caves, just as the city of Qumran, where these monks were living, called the Essenes, they were even more strict than the Pharisees. They were so strict they had to get out of Jerusalem, get away from all the sinning people. So they went out in the desert, they copied scrolls, they worshiped, they prayed, they sang, and it was basically a monastery. Okay? And when they heard that the Romans in 66 AD to 8 to 70 were coming to overwhelm Israel, and that's when the temple was destroyed in AD 70, they took their precious scrolls and they hid them in these sandstone caves. There's over 2,000 of those caves following the Dead Sea. And so these precious scrolls were put in these jars and inside these caves, so that when it did rain, they couldn't get ruined. Remember, these scrolls are made out of paper, and some are made out of animal skins. They go bad. The paper ones only last about 100 years. But they were in the perfect condition for survival. This is a copy of the Isaiah scroll found in Cave 1. Okay? It contains all 66 chapters. So now what's the big question? Because it comes from about 200 BC. And our modern Old Testament, we use the Masoretic text from AD 1000, approximately. 1008, if you need the exact number. So now we've got something that is 1,200 years older than what we had for our modern Bibles. So if there's going to be copying problems, are we going to see them? 1,200 years. And guess what? There was some misspelled words. But as a teacher, I can tell you, misspelled words don't scare me. Because I lived with them every single day. And you can usually tell what they meant. About 95% of the variance in the text from this ancient one to the modern one was things like misspelled words, or words that are naturally spelled two different ways. Now, the enemies of the Bible count those as mistakes, but they're really not. You know, the preamble of the Constitution, in order to form a more perfect union. I graded a paper once that said, in order to form a more perfect onion. Now, do you think I was sitting there pulling my hair out, trying to figure out what the student meant? Is that a mistake? Yep. I circled it in red, and I don't take any points off because he only had one error. Got to have 3 before I take points off. Now, I'm going to err on the side of mercy because I'm hoping for some later on. So it's been overplayed. Now, the other thing that we've got, there's the Qumran ruins, there's the scroll jars. That's the actual document. You can go to Israel, and they have a museum with this actual document. Look at how good a shape it's in. They've got the whole text in Hebrew. And today it matches so well to the Masoretic text that even in new versions of the Bible, they've only made a couple little changes. So, is it absolutely perfect, as if God wrote it down like he did the Ten Commandments from Moses? No. But it's very, very good. Okay? And you can tell that even if a verse was different and the change made sense, which most of the time it wouldn't, it would be onion or something like that. You got all of these other copies of the New Testament that are in existence, over 25,000. That's a lot of ancient copies. So experts in the field then can take a lot of these copies and they can compare them. Now, if I dictate something to you guys and somebody leaves out a sentence, are all of you going to leave out the same sentence? Of course not. If one person spells a word wrong, is everybody going to spell the same word wrong? So you can get back to the original text through the comparison of the copies. My last point will be this. If we're going to say that those tiny errors make a difference in our Bible, then for the same reason, we would have to reject all of this ancient literature, who have a lot less copies and a lot more time between the original writings and the copies that we have. You'd have to use the same logic and tell your college professor, I can't read Aristotle or Plato, I'm sorry, sir, but I just don't trust that they've been copied correctly. I hope you don't have to take any more classes from that professor. They won't like that. So we'll stop here. There's some additional slides. I did that on purpose. I was taught always have extra material. That way you don't have to stand up here and look stupid. So I've saved stand up here and look stupid for the Q&A period. So I think
Thank you, Dr. Meyer. Thank you very much.
We're going to transition right into that.
So a couple questions here. The first big pressing question, and Harrison Ford might be asking this as well. Where exactly is the Ark of the Covenant?
All right. Just a second. Always have to have an escape plan. Nobody knows. The outside of the Ark of the Covenant, what's it made out of? Well, it's gold, but it's overlaid the wood. So how well does wood do after 6,000 years or 4,000? So it could have deteriorated. We know where it was right up until the time that the Babylonians came and destroyed Jerusalem and took the temple treasures back to Babylon. Would that fall into the category of temple treasure? I would think so. So if I had to take an educated guess, I would say it went back to Babylon, and after that it wasn't found again. There's rumors that say, and there is a tunnel system under the temple. We can't get at it because it's overseen by the Muslims right now, Islam. They won't let anybody down there, no archaeologists. Somebody could have hid it down there. Knowing that the Babylonians were going to break in, they could have maybe got it out ahead of time. Okay, so somebody's going to have to find it. Be careful on, even though I love YouTube, and I fix my lawnmower, and I'm not very handy. You watch enough videos. Okay, but there, when it comes to a lot of things, and archaeology is one of them, you're going to see things that look good, but they're not. Okay? Because, you know, in the YouTube world, you just want to get a maximum number of hits, right? Almost fell down. And so you don't have to tell the truth. Like some of the stories that have, there's some good slides here. Look at that tomb and the round stone they rolled away. But what I wanted to show you is, this is an excellent book. If you can invest $15 on Amazon or wherever you get it, it's relatively new. I think it came out last year. Titus Kennedy is a known archaeologist, and I love the structure of this book. It has 100 discoveries. What I really like about it is every discovery is only 2 pages long. So if you're like me, and you're a type A personality, and you can only read for about 10 minutes before you feel you have to run a marathon, then you'll like this book. Because you can just pick them off and select the ones you want. And it tells you what was found, where it was found, who found it, how it relates to the Bible in 2 pages. Lots of pictures for you younger folks.
Excellent.
Okay?
Thank you, sir.
I'd really recommend that. So they don't know where the ark is. It might show up. We're going to see it someday, as you know. God could have taken it to heaven. The Bible doesn't say that, but so that's the best I can do. I hope the other ones are
The
that
assumption
easy.
of the Ark of the Covenant. Wow. Talk about
Yeah,
typology.
I don't think that'll preach, but
Okay.
you never know.
All right, here we go. And just as a reminder for parents, if your kiddos are in childcare, if you would want to go fetch them, now would be an excellent time if you want them to be in the building still when you fetch them. Second question here. You just noted this, sir. The 2 million Jews. Is there archaeological evidence of 2 million Jews traversing the desert from Egypt for 40 years?
What kind of evidence would we hope to find? Sometimes the best answer is a question. What kind of evidence would we hope to find in the desert? I don't know. So it's definitely not really clear. But the other thing I would say is there's been recent evidence that the Exodus route that we always thought to be true is not the way they went. Now, wouldn't that answer a lot of questions? Okay. And it even looks like we may not have properly identified Mount Sinai in the Sinai Peninsula. And there's a site over in Saudi Arabia, which means they would have had to go around the mount. They could have stayed near water and then crossed on the other side. The Red Sea has 2 forks, right? Crossed on the other side. There's a mountain there that's burned at the top, just like the Bible says. Okay? But yeah, I'm not sure what you'd find. You know, if they buried their people, maybe you could find some bones, but, you know, they're going to be 3,500 years old. They didn't make any permanent structures, right? They didn't really grow their own crops. So we might be asking a little much to expect to find a lot.
Okay, thank you.
That's the best
We'll
I can
try to do a couple more. Again, we
Okay.
have several good ones here. This one's about Esther Is the character Esther from the book of Esther in the Old Testament based on a real person?
Well, we think it is because we know that the history around it makes sense. The Persians did come and basically end the Babylonian exile after the 70 years that God said they would be in Babylon. And the Persians were they still wanted to rule you, but they wanted to rule you by making you pretty happy. So they said to the Jewish groups and at least a dozen other ones that were also captured in Babylon, the Persians said, we're going to allow you to go back where you came from. We're even going to give you money for the trip. And they actually gave money to help rebuild the first temple. Because up to that time, they didn't have a main structure for the temple. So it does kind of fit the type of people that the Persians were. So I tend to buy something like that. It is true, and this one is, it is true that the only Old Testament book that is not represented in the Dead Sea Scrolls is, guess what? Esther. So, it could possibly just be a story, but it would be a story that fits the history of the time. Okay? When it comes down to some of the stories, I know as a teacher, I have at times made up a story to get a point across. And there's a big argument in New Testament circles of whether all the parables are actually true or whether Jesus was formulating a story that made sense to them culturally and historically, but may not have actually happened. Now, I'm more conservative, so I think the parables happen, okay? But they could serve the same purpose if they were stories. So that's a good question about Esther. I would say that she did. The other thing about the book of Esther is that I think it's the only Old Testament book that does not contain the covenant name of God within its writings. And the Essenes, who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls and collected them, were stricter than the Pharisees. And because they didn't see God's covenant name in that book, they rejected it. I like that one too.
Okay.
All right.
Just want a little shout out again to your PDF. It's available on the Catholicism on Tap website. So on your tables, you have a fridge magnet, because who doesn't have a fridge? So you can take that home with you and throw it on your fridge. Before you do right now, if you grab it and take out your cell phone and open your photo app, you can just scan that circular QR code. That'll bring you to the Catholicism on Tap website, where you can see not only all 68, or is it 78 slides that Dr. Gary put up there, but you'll also see all of our past videos and presentations that have been recorded, as well as the schedule for topics to come. Also, I want to note here that the food in the back is going to be out for 5 minutes after Dr. Gary's done. So if you still got a little rumbly in the tumbly, as Pooh Bear says, make sure you come back here and grab some vegetables or some fruit. There's even a couple donuts. Okay, let's do 2 more here. Most ancient Middle Eastern religions have a flood narrative, Dr. Gary. How do we know that Noah's Ark from the book of Genesis isn't just a story that's copied from other ancient stories?
Well, that is a common argument. There's the Gilgamesh epic is one of them that comes to mind. I think there's about 7 or 8 flood stories in the Mesopotamian Fertile Crescent area that do talk about a major flood. Okay? But the fact that there's 7 stories from 7 different civilizations shouldn't bring up so many questions about copying as they bring up what point? There was a flood. Okay? And scholars still argue a little bit about whether it covered the whole earth. The liberal scholars, of course, would say no, and the more conservative scholars would say yes. Okay? But I don't know, you're getting into tricky territory to say, who copied from whom, and was copying even necessary when these other civilizations were experiencing the same flood, and perhaps wrote it down as the flood started. So the more you study the ancient Hebrew religion, the less it becomes reasonable that they copied from the Egyptians or the Zoroastrians, even though those religions are slightly older than Judaism. But God goes back to the very beginning, right? So the existence of God and his development precede all of those civilizations, according to the Bible.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you, sir. Also, a little a point here. On your way out, if your interest has been piqued in diving deeper into your intellectual formation as a Christian, I'd recommend you just check out any of the variety of books here on your way out, from apologetics of prayer to interreligious dialogue among Christians, to how do we know that God exists, why celibate priests, and you name it. There's a bunch of interesting books. If you don't have money, don't worry. Just grab a book on your way out. Also, there's merch. Okay, one final question here, and I don't know how to choose this. I'll just apologize to the anonymous writers of these other questions. Let's see. Have you watched this is kind of a big hit series on Amazon. Have you watched The House of David on Amazon? And if so, any comments on the accuracy or inaccuracy of that television show?
I remember watching a couple of episodes about 4 or 5 years ago, and I remember being angry, but I can't remember why I was angry. But I can guess it was inconsistent with the scriptures. Okay, would be one thing. I was hoping you'd ask about The Chosen, because I have very good things to say about that. I could go back and watch it and give a better answer, but I know I didn't like it. And usually I don't like it because, at least from subtly, a lot of those programs, and you might like National Geographic, but if you're a believer, they're not really our friend. Because evolution, okay? And macroevolution. And so it might have been, I don't know if it was on there. Amazon picks up a lot of that. I might go back and do it, but I won't know who to contact. But I know I didn't like it, and I know I didn't like it for a good reason.
Fair enough. Well, and then a subtle their pitch for the Chosen series. Okay, well, thank you for coming out, sir, and for your time in prepping these slides. Again, go on the Catholicism on Tap website if you want to spend a little bit of time studying the other 30 slides that he didn't get to. Thank you for coming out. Let's put our hands together for Dr. Gary. And thanks for coming out, everybody. God bless. We'll see you next month. You'll see some flyers for that. It's going to be Father Joe Richards talking on the crisis of fatherhood. So feel free to hang out as long as you want. Again, grab some stuff on the way out. And thanks for coming out.